If you can hear this message, listen closely. To the exiled, misunderstood, or upside down, this is your message of hope. When problems come, use them. When enemies persecute you, love them. These struggles are a fire, refining you into gold. Look around. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. Challenge what is expected of you. This world is not your home. You are different.
Up here because Pastor Dave and Autumn had their baby a couple weeks ago. So if you weren't here to hear that, that's good news. We're excited about that. With the birth of a new baby will come comments like, oh, the baby's got her father's nose, or the baby's got her father's eyes, or my favorite is always, the baby's got her father's smile, because I'm always like, look at the baby and I'm like, now last time I saw Pastor Dave, I'm pretty sure he had teeth. But that's we get traits from our parents. That's what happens is we get traits from our parents, and it's not just physical traits either. We get character traits from our parents, and it's not just biological children that get traits from their parents. Adopted children get traits from their parents as well. I've met kids who were adopted from Russia. I've met kids who were adopted from China. I've met kids who were adopted from the Ukraine. And you know what? They're all Americans. Why? Because their adopted parents were Americans, and they got those traits that they inherited from their parents. And that leads us into today's passage. Today's passage will be 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 21. So if you have a Bible app, you can open it up to 1 Peter 1, 13 through 21. If you don't have a Bible app, there's this little thing called Google, and you can Google 1 Peter 1, 13 through 21, and it'll come right up. But what I want to do is I want to read through the whole passage. It's kind of a complex passage. So I want to read through the whole thing, and then we'll take it apart bit by bit. So 1 Peter 1, 13 through 21 starts with, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who has called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your fathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last time for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. All right, so that was a kind of a long, complex passage. So I want to take it apart. So let's take it apart, and we'll start with that very first word. The very first word there is therefore. And whenever you see a therefore in Scripture, you've got to ask, what's it there for? Because therefore is a transitional verb. It says, because the stuff that came before it is true, this is how you shall respond. So you got to ask what came before it. And those of you who were here last week know that some of the things that came before this were that the readers of this letter were born again in living hope. The readers of this letter accepted faith that is in Christ. The faith that they accepted was passed down from early Christians onto them. So basically it's saying, because you are Christians, therefore, and then everything that comes after it. So this message is largely going to be for a Christian audience. That's who Peter's writing to. But if you're not a Christian, stay tuned, because we have something for you too. But this message primarily is for a Christian audience. So it says, therefore, or because you are a Christian, preparing your minds for action. And I'll give you a little Bible reading tip here. You'll see a little asterisk above this little part if you're in the SV, and those asterisks mean that there's a footnote, or maybe it's a little number 1 there or something. That means that there's a footnote, and those footnotes are awesome because a lot of times they'll give you some insight into the original Greek. And a lot of times the original Greek is pretty interesting. This one is not going to let you down. The footnote here says that what's translated as preparing your minds for action literally means gird up the loins of your mind. So you say, gird up the loins of your mind. What does that mean? What's it mean to gird up the loins of your mind? Well, back in those days, people used to wear longer garments than I am wearing today, and if they expected some form of action to be happening, they would want to make sure that their clothes weren't dangling around their legs and getting in the way. Imagine, ladies, if you had to run through the woods wearing a dress. It probably wouldn't be the best attire for it. So what they would do is they would wrap those up around their legs and make kind of shorts out of them so that they'd be prepared for action. So so what that means is preparing your minds for action, exactly as it was translated in the ESV. But I think that to get the full picture of what's going on, you got to picture your mind girding up its loins for action. So it continues there. Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And this brings us to our first major point, and your point on the map. And that's that Christians think differently because we prepare our minds differently. And we prepare our minds differently because we have hope. And we got to look at that word hope, because in our culture, hope can mean something different than what hope really means. Hope in our culture might be used for something like, I hope to win the lottery someday. Like, if any of you ever heard anybody say, I hope to win the lottery someday, maybe you've said it yourself, I hope to win the lottery someday. Well, that's not a hope. That's a wish. If all the hope that you have, like, ladies, if you're dating a boy and he tells you, hey, babe, I hope to win the lottery someday. Guess what? You're dating somebody who's hopeless. Because if that's the only hope they have, there is no hope there. It's not a real hope. A real hope is backed by some sort of assurance. And Christian hope is backed by an assurance from God. It says, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. This is a sure hope. It's a guaranteed hope. And whenever you have a guaranteed hope, it makes you behave differently. It makes you act differently. It makes you do things differently. It enables you to be a little bit different. So imagine I go to the car dealership to buy my first car. And I go onto the lot and I tell the car dealer, I'm here to buy a car. And the dealer's like, all right, sale. Yeah. So he says, all right, let's get you into a car. How much do you have? Well, I don't have much money. That's all right, we've got credit. Oh, okay. Well, I don't have a job, but I do hope to win the lottery someday. The car dealer's probably going to be like, okay, maybe we can put you in over here. We've got some 2002 Ford Ford Focuses. It's kind of rusty. One door fell off of it a while ago. Doesn't have an engine, but maybe we can set you up for that. So that's how I would behave if I had no hope. I'd be driving around in that. But let's say instead, I had a wealthy uncle who passed away and left me a trust fund. And I go into the dealership and I'm like, here for a car. The dealer's like, all right, I hope you're better than that last guy. And I say, I don't have a job. All right, well, we might be able to get you credit. But I do have this trust fund for $1 million that's in the bank that's guaranteed to come out whenever I turn 18. What's the dealer going to do? He's going to be like, well, we got these brand new Teslas over here. I might be able to get you into one of those, right? The hope for the future, a sure hope, affects what happens today. And that's how Peter starts off this passage is, you've got a sure hope, and that's going to affect how you prepare your minds. So how does this future hope affect our current behavior? Well, he says, first, you've got to be sober-minded. Well, what's sober-minded mean? Sober-minded means to be rational, to be clear-headed, to be able to think things through. So we sometimes we think sober-minded might be related to like the opposite of being intoxicated, but it's really just being clear-headed, being somebody who is rational. So the things that can make you not sober-minded are things like an irrational fear, envy, pride, jealousy. These things can make us not be rational. But alcohol can too. So whenever it says sober-minded, you can sometimes think in the terms of people who've had too much to drink, because they are not sober-minded. They don't behave rationally. They might get into fights. They might drive recklessly. They might just be loud. So since we have a future hope, since we have a guaranteed hope, we're supposed to be sober-minded. And later in this letter, Peter gives a reason for why we should be sober-minded. He says, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So we don't have lions too often here in Western Pennsylvania, do we? So I want us to kind of change that a little bit to something we have here. So I want you to imagine that you're out camping. So you're out camping, and while you're camping, a bear shows up at your campsite. And he's prowling around, seeking someone to devour. Well, if you're clear-headed, if you're sober-minded, what do? Probably stay real quiet, right? Kind of hide back so the bear doesn't see you. So you're being sober-minded, you're being rational, you're hiding back so the bear doesn't see you. Here comes Uncle Cletus, who's out camping with you. And Uncle Cletus has his 30-pack of Busch beer, because he's not sober-minded. And how's Uncle Cletus going to act? He's going to be loud, he's going to be obnoxious, he's going to knock things over. And guess what's going to happen to Uncle Cletus? He's going to be devoured by that bear. Now, hopefully, you're still sober-minded and you can run away while he's devouring Uncle Cletus. But be sober-minded. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. Don't act foolishly. Act clearly. Act rationally. But it says, in addition to not acting foolishly, we need to have our minds be ready for action. So how do we make our minds ready for action? Well, one way is that we read Scripture regularly. We read it carefully. We surround ourselves with people who are wise, who are good counsel, who will build us up. And we pray. Prayer is a good way to prepare your minds for action. So our first major point was we prepare our minds differently, which causes us to think differently because we have a different hope. We're going to continue reading in the word here. It says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. When we become Christians, whenever we accept Jesus, whenever we decide that we're going to commit our lives to following Jesus, we are adopted into God's family. And as I mentioned previously, adopted children take on the characteristics of their adopted parents, right? If you know a kid who was adopted from Russia, they're not going to speak Russian as their primary language. Even though they were born into a Russian-speaking family, the fact that they were adopted by an English-speaking family means that they're going to speak English, right? So you take on the characteristics of your adopted parents. Who is our adopted parent? Well, God the Father adopts us. So if we're adopted by God the Father and we begin to take on his characteristics, we should become more like him. And specifically, it says, but as he who has called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. So in what way are we to be like our adopted father? Well, we are supposed to be holy. And that makes us think, well, we sing a lot of songs with holy in it. We talk about holy God. But what does that term really mean? What's it mean to be holy? Well, to be holy means to be perfectly righteous and to be set apart from all else. How many of you are perfectly righteous in here? I don't see any hand. Oh, I saw a hand over there. Oh, you were straightening out your sweatshirt. Okay. That was my daughter, so I could probably testify that, yeah, she gets her hand up as quickly as I do, really, which is not very quickly at all on that. But when you're adopted by God, you are to become more holy. But it's not something that happens instantaneously. Just like if I were to adopt a 4-year-old from Russia tomorrow, he's not going to speak English right away, right? It's going to take some time. As he's in my household, as he's part of my family, he's going to become more and more and more like my family. So as we're adopted into God's household, we do become more and more like him through a process. That process is called sanctification, and we become more and more holy. So let's continue reading here, and it says, and if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. And that brings us to the next point on the map, which is Christians fear differently because we were adopted by a perfect Father. So now there seems to be a dichotomy here. Dichotomy means when two things seem to be at odds with one another. Like two things just don't seem to go together. I said we had a hope. I said our hope was a sure hope. It was a guaranteed hope. It was backed by the power of God. But I also said that we should fear. Now, if you have a sure hope, should you fear? Is there anything to fear when you know what the end is going to be? Doesn't that seem like they're at odds, like there's a dichotomy there? Like here it says at the beginning of our passage, the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation, or hope in the grace that will be, it's guaranteed, brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. But it also says, conduct yourselves in fear throughout the time of your exile. So for this, we need to think of different types of fear, because there are different types of fear, right? Whenever you're watching a scary movie and the music starts to change and it starts to kind of speed up a little bit, kind of imitating a heartbeat that's starting to race, and you see a mirror in the screen during a scary movie, you know a mirror in a scary movie is not good. Because you know what happens next. That freaky girl is going to appear in that mirror. The freaky girl that's in every horror movie. And if it's a super scary horror movie, she's going to have a twin. So that is a type of fear. Like whenever that happens in a horror movie, that's a type of fear. But then there's another type of fear. A type of fear where maybe some of you experience this. I hope you don't have to experience this too often in your life, but that's a type of fear like whenever you get a phone call that somebody you love has a terminal illness, and you start to consider what's this earth going to be like without that person being around anymore. That's a fear. That's an overwhelming fear. And then there's a fear that happens when you're out camping with your Uncle Cletus and a bear shows up. Right? There's a fear that happens there whenever that bear shows up. But this biblical fear is going to be a little bit different. This biblical fear is going to be about who we are as sinners and how God is as a perfectly holy God. And you might have a little tiny inkling of this fear if you've ever met a celebrity. I can tell you a few years ago, I had the honor of meeting my favorite historian. Yeah, I have a favorite historian. So what? Don't you? I did. I had the honor of meeting my favorite historian, and whenever I got up to talk to him, my voice was trembling. I was nervous meeting this guy. And why? Why was I nervous? Was I nervous because he was going to be like my Uncle Cletus and get me eaten by a bear? Nope. Was I worried that he was going to take away somebody I love? No. Was I worried that there was a table behind him and some freaky girl was going to be doing a weird spider crawl out from behind it? No, it wasn't any of those types of fear. I wasn't worried about any of that. The tremble in my voice came from the fact that he was somebody I respected very much, and I didn't really feel worthy to be standing in his presence. That's the type of fear that we have with God. Or imagine that you're a basketball player, and you're pretty good. You start for your high school team. You're not fantastic, but you're good enough to make the starting team. And they have a contest with Nike's having a contest, and you win it. And as the grand prize in this contest, you get a one-on-one coaching session with LeBron James. He's coaching you, not you him. As I said, you're good. You're not that good. So you're standing there on the court waiting for King James to come out. And he starts walking on the court, dribbling his basketball. Boom, boom, boom. What do you think? A little bit nervous? A little bit of fear in you right now as you're standing on the court with LeBron James? Now, this is going to be a fearful situation. Again, not because he's going to do any harm to you, but he's great, and you're not. That's how it is with God. And LeBron James is probably going to change you a little bit. He's going to make you better at basketball. And we don't like change a lot. But he's LeBron James, and you're not. Now, if you take that little bit of nervousness you have there and multiply it by a trillion, that begins to let you understand what the fear is like whenever you're standing in the presence of a holy God. So Philippians 2:12b through 13 says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." So why should we be fearful? Why should we be fearful in what we do, how we conduct ourselves? Because guess what? It's not you working whenever you're living a Christian life. It's God working through you. You have the power of the God of the universe flowing through you. If that doesn't terrify you, then you don't have a good image of what God is. You don't have a good recognition of the power of God. If having the power of God in you doesn't give you some pause of consideration. So this particular verse ends, "Throughout the time of your exile." And that brings us to our next point, which is, and it's on your map, Christians live differently because we are exiles. And there's a difference between being an exile and being an immigrant. Immigrants are people who choose to leave one culture to live in another culture. Like maybe they're moving there because there are career opportunities there, so they're moving. Or maybe they're becoming missionaries, so they move into this new culture. Or maybe they're moving because their family moved, and that's why they're moving there. But there's a choice involved, and whenever they move, because they're planning on being there permanently, they're going to adopt the customs and lifestyles and languages of that place. They're going to have their favorite restaurants. They're going to have their favorite their favorite sporting team in that area. They're going to get to know all the neighbors. They're going to just be immersed in that new culture. They're going to take on the identity of that culture. That's how immigrants behave. An exile, though, is different. An exile is somebody who leaves one culture for another culture because they were kind of forced out. Maybe there was a war. Maybe there was a famine. Maybe there was some sort of natural disaster that forced them to go from one place to another. But they're not planning on staying there. As soon as that war ends, guess what? They're planning on picking up their bags and moving back home. As soon as that famine's over, they're planning on picking up their bags and going back home. As soon as that natural disaster is cleaned up, they're planning on picking up their bags and heading back home. And because they're exiles, they're not going to adopt the customs of the culture around them. They're going to live differently. They're going to kind of stand out. They're going to keep the culture of the place where they belong. Exiles don't feel like they belong in this new place. They're in a place where they don't belong. And because they don't belong there, they're going to behave differently. So whenever you become a Christian, you start to feel like an exile. You start to recognize that this isn't the final place where you belong. This fallen, sinful world isn't your final place where you belong. You belong somewhere else. So you start to behave like an exile. Or as 1 Corinthians 5:20 says, it calls you an ambassador for Christ. So what's an ambassador? An ambassador is somebody who lives in one country while representing another country. So you could imagine that I was appointed the ambassador to England for the United States. Let's say that happens. I gave Trump a really big campaign donation or something. So I'm appointed as ambassador to England. So I go over to England, and whenever I get there, I start to develop a diet of eating fish and chips every night. And I decide that I really like cricket. So I give up all on American football and baseball, and I start to become an avid cricket fan, whatever that is. And I decide that instead of flying the Stars and Stripes outside of my home there, I'm going to fly the Union Jack. What's going to happen to me as ambassador to England? Probably going to get fired because I'm not doing my job. As an ambassador, what I want to be doing is representing the American culture while I'm in England. So we're to be ambassadors while we're here. We're not supposed to adopt the culture of the place that we live. We're supposed to have the culture of the place where we belong and bring that to the place where we are at. That's how ambassadors behave. So the culture that we're representing is the kingdom of heaven. We're representing while we're in this fallen, sinful world. So you can think about, because you're an ambassador, because you're an exile, people should recognize that you're an exile, right? If you have a foreign exchange student at your school, probably people recognize that this person is a little bit different. Like they obviously were not in America their entire lives. And people should recognize that you're different because you're an exile. And then let me tell you a story about one time whenever I had a reality check. After I became a Christian, whenever I was working at my job, I was at a work meeting, and it was about 2 years after becoming a Christian. I was at a work meeting, and I mentioned to somebody that I was a Christian. And they looked at me, with shock. Like, really? You're a Christian? And I was like, yeah, I've been one for about 2 years. And that hurt, because what it told me was that in this area of my life, I was living like a native. I wasn't living like an exile. I wasn't living like somebody who belonged somewhere else. So I actually had to change, and now in that area of my life, I do try to live like an exile, and nobody's surprised whenever I tell them they're Christian now, because they're like, yes, we know. And I'm like the person that whenever something happens in their life and they need prayers, they'll be the first to come to me. So, but yeah, it was a real reality check because I was living like a native rather than an exile. So our passage continues here. Knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. And that brings us to our next map point, which is Christians are different because we were ransomed to be different. We don't just act different. We don't just prepare our minds differently. We don't just behave differently. We are different. To be ransomed means to be bought with a price. We normally think of ransom in terms of kidnappings, but in biblical times it was more often used in the case of somebody who was a debt slave. Somebody who owed somebody money, they couldn't pay it off, so that person basically took that other person as a slave until they could work off the money that they owed. But another person could come in, pay the debt that person owed, and that person was free. That ransom has been paid. They no longer owe that money. The higher the debt, the higher the ransom price that would need to be paid to free that person. So we see here that it says we were ransomed, not with perishable things such as silver or gold. So this ransom price is pretty high. Whenever it's like there's not enough silver or gold in the world to pay your ransom, that's a pretty high ransom price, right? Gold's worth a lot. Silver's not worth quite as much, but it's worth a lot. If you want to give me some silver, I'll take it. But what were we ransomed with? The precious blood of Christ. God is perfectly holy. And because he is perfectly holy, he is perfectly repulsed by sin. And the more we recognize how holy God is, the more we are repulsed by our own sin, the more we see how terrible, ugly our sin is to God. And the more that we recognize how repulsive our sin is, the more value we put on that ransom price. But if we go back to the Old Testament, Psalm 49, 7 through 9, Psalm 49, 7 through 9 says, "Truly, no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. For the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice, that he should live on forever and never see the pit." This is bad news here, because what this is saying is the ransom price is too high, and no man can pay that ransom price to get us out of eternal death. And here we have a dichotomy again, or what looks to be a dichotomy. Two things that seem to be at odds with one another. That passage from the 49th Psalm that I just read says that no man can give a ransom. But what we are reading in 1 Peter says, knowing that you were, past tense, you were ransomed. So, which one's right? Can we be ransomed or can we not be ransomed? They're both right. Whenever you're asking about a part of the Bible, if it's right or not, go with it's right. So that's a false dichotomy. They're both right. Jesus is not merely a man. He's fully man, indeed, but he's also fully God. And Jesus lived a perfect life that you or I or no other man could live. So when the psalm says no man could ransom another, it's right. But God becoming man, living a perfect life that no man could live, he could. And his blood is the ransom price. It was an infinitely valuable ransom price. So when we put our trust in Christ, the ransom has been paid, and we are completely free from that moment. But that's not the end of the gospel story. That's the beginning of the gospel message. Because we weren't ransomed just to be ransomed. We were ransomed for a reason. Titus 2:14 says, Jesus gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. What's it mean to be zealous? To be zealous for something means that it's like all you think about. It's what you live. It's what you breathe. It's what you do. When you wake up in the morning, you're thinking about this. When you go to bed at night, you're thinking about this. You're zealous. You would give your life for this thing. So we weren't ransomed for nothing. We were ransomed for something. And it says that Jesus wants a people for himself. He wants you to be his people, ransomed to be zealous for good works. So he wants you to be free. He wants you to be, your ransom price is paid. He wants you to be free from the sin that held you in bondage. There's a psychological condition known as Stockholm Syndrome. Anybody ever hear of Stockholm Syndrome before? goes back to a bank robbery that occurred in Stockholm Syndrome. This is where it was, or Stockholm, Sweden. This is where it was first identified. Stockholm Syndrome in Stockholm, Sweden. And what happened in this bank robbery is the bank robbery didn't go well. It didn't go according to plan, and like a lot of bank robberies that don't go according to plan, they took some hostages. So they took these hostages, and then eventually the police were able to free the hostages. The police were like, all right, we got the hostages, we got these witnesses. This will be an open and shut case at the trial because we have all these witnesses now. The problem was the witnesses, the hostages, started identifying with the kidnappers. And they started to want more of what the kidnappers had than what the people who paid their ransom and freed them had. And they didn't want to testify. Stockholm Syndrome's a mental condition. It's something that I don't know if this is the politically correct term for it, but it means you're nuts if you have Stockholm Syndrome. But we Christians can get that. We can be free from our sinful past. We can recognize that our ransom's been paid and still want to go back to that bondage of slavery or of sin. So we don't, but that means we're nuts when we do that. It means we have a mental condition. We need to get over that. We need to be free from that Stockholm Syndrome. So, Christian, you are different because you are ransomed to be different, but that's not the end of our passage. We want to keep going. The passage wraps up with, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and your hope are in God. So if you're wondering how you can walk in obedience, how you can do all these things differently that were mentioned on the map when you struggle so much, I've got good news for you. And our good news is the final point on the map. Christian, you can be different because your faith and your hope isn't in yourself, it's in God. If your faith and hope were in yourself, you'd probably be right that you couldn't do it, because I know I couldn't. I've seen evidence. I've had 40 years of evidence of me screwing things up. 41 years of evidence of me screwing things up, of knowing that if my faith and hope were in me, I'd be out of luck. But my faith and my hope are in God. And God can help me to overcome my sinful nature. So, all of our map points were directed at Christians, but I said there's a message here for non-Christians too. So I want to talk to the non-Christians here. If you are not a Christian and you have been crushed by the weight of your sin, if you have that unmistakable feeling of guilt bearing over you, over something that you've done or something that you keep going back to. You know it's wrong. You know it hurts you. You know it hurts others. But you keep going back to it and you struggle. And you know that there's something separating you and God. And you know that this isn't the way it's supposed to be. You know that. You know that this isn't the way my life is supposed to be. I've got good news for you. The ransom price for whatever guilt you feel has been paid. It has been paid. So don't live like somebody with Stockholm Syndrome. Live like somebody who's free. Somebody who's free to be connected to God, because Christ's blood is far more powerful than your sin. Put your trust in him, and he's going to help you overcome that fear, that ransom's been paid. The God of the universe can go from being an enemy to being an ally. And those of you who are Christians, remember that you were adopted by a loving and holy Father. So as adopted children, reflect the characteristics of your adoptive Father.